The last photograph of Jordan Malley was taken at 4:16 p.m. on October 21st, 2012. He's sitting cross-legged near a campfire, his cheeks slightly red from the cold, his hands outstretched toward the flames. He's wearing a red and black flannel jacket, a knit beanie too big for his head, and a faint, hesitant smile that doesn't quite match the grins of the other two in frame. Next to him is his classmate Connor Brooks, same age, more at ease, and behind them, half turned toward the woods, is Connor's father, Alan, 52, wiry, and focused on something outside the shot. It was the first day of a 2-night camping trip in Loyalsock State Forest, Pennsylvania. They had hiked in earlier that afternoon with supplies for the weekend. Alan had camped in the area before and claimed to know the trails better than most. Jordan hadn't. This was his first time in real wilderness. By all accounts, Jordan was a quiet kid, liked books more than sports, didn't speak much in class unless called on, and kept a small circle of friends. His mother, Dana Malley, was protective. She'd asked him several times if he was sure about going. He told her Connor had invited him weeks earlier and that Alan was a pro at this stuff. Dana later admitted she wasn't entirely comfortable with it, but she also didn't want to be the kind of parent who says no to everything. Jordan was 13. This was supposed to be a milestone, his first solo trip with friends. The text she got that morning simply read, "We made it. It's cold but cool. I'll send pics." It was the last message she ever received from her son. The camp was pitched near a ridge above a shallow stream, a few miles off a lesser-used trail network. It wasn't an official campground, but Alan Brooks had insisted it was safer than the busier areas. They'd set up 2 tents, gathered dry wood, and filtered water from the creek. According to Connor, everything felt normal until just after dusk. Alan told police that Jordan had offered to gather more kindling before dark, wanting to help. It was around 5:45 p.m. when he walked into the trees, alone, wearing a headlamp and gloves. He didn't come back. At first, neither Alan nor Connor thought much of it. 10 minutes, then 15 passed. Alan later said he assumed Jordan had gotten distracted, maybe found something interesting. But when an hour went by and darkness fully settled in, concern turned to alarm. Alan and Connor searched the surrounding woods with flashlights, calling Jordan's name, checking downed logs and creek bends. Around 8:30, Alan used his satellite phone to call 911. Dispatch recorded the call as a juvenile lost in remote forest terrain. Search and rescue teams arrived shortly after midnight. They deployed a perimeter grid, first with foot patrols and dogs, then aerial scans by daylight. But the forest was unforgiving, the ground soft with leaf fall, the undergrowth thick, the terrain uneven. No scent trail was found. No footprints were visible. By sunrise, there were over 30 personnel in the woods and a helicopter overhead. Still nothing. Jordan had vanished in less than 100 yards of open forest, as if the trees had closed behind him. Dana arrived just after 5 a.m., having driven through the night from her home near Allentown. She hadn't slept. She stood beside the search tent as strangers in uniforms moved through maps and radios, and she kept asking the same question no one could answer. How could a 13-year-old disappear within earshot of 2 people and leave no trace? She asked Connor again and again what exactly Jordan had said before going. He told her, "Just getting more firewood, be right back." Alan kept repeating the same thing, that he let him go because it was still light, because Jordan wanted to be helpful, because he'd been fine all day. But something didn't sit right. Not with Dana. Not with some of the searchers, not with people who knew Jordan. He wasn't the kind of kid to wander. He didn't know the terrain. He didn't like being alone in unfamiliar places. His mother later told investigators that Jordan had asked if he'd be sharing a tent with Connor, not Alan, and that he didn't want to do anything dumb in the woods. These weren't the words of a bold explorer. They were the quiet caution of a boy trying to fit in without slipping too far out of his comfort zone. By Sunday afternoon, 24 hours after the disappearance, authorities expanded the search to a 5-mile radius. Still no sign. The dogs didn't bark. The brush didn't stir. There were no broken branches, no dropped glove, no scuff marks, no voice in the dark calling back. Just silence. Allen gave a brief interview that evening to a local TV crew standing near the trailhead, voice cracking. "We're doing everything we can," he said. "I just want Jordan to know we're not stopping until we find him." Behind him, Dana stood off camera, arms wrapped around herself, eyes locked on the tree line as if hoping to spot a red flannel through the pines. That night, the temperature dropped into the 30s. Rain moved in, and whatever scent or trace Jordan may have left, if any, began to dissolve into the forest floor. By Monday morning, the case shifted from a missing child to an ongoing wilderness search, but the optimism that had fueled the early hours was gone. Something was wrong. Something felt wrong. And as the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, no one, not the search teams, not the locals, not even Jordan's mother, could explain how a boy could vanish from a campsite in the final light of an autumn day and never be seen again. The first 72 hours after Jordan Malley disappeared were marked by a kind of controlled chaos, a well-oiled machine of procedures, strategy, and growing desperation. By sunrise the next morning, the Pennsylvania State Police had taken over coordination from the local sheriff. Teams were split into search sectors, air, ground, and K-9. They pulled in volunteer firefighters, trained wilderness units, even a specialized cadaver dog team from out of state. The goal was simple: recover a living boy before the cold did. But as hours stretched and terrain closed in, the forest began to feel less like a place they were searching and more like something swallowing the search itself. Bloodhounds from the 1st K-9 unit were able to pick up a trail, faint but consistent, beginning from the edge of the fire ring where Jordan had last been seen. The dogs led searchers about a quarter-mile downhill through a tangle of rhododendron and pine scrub, then abruptly lost the scent near a dry creek bed. That's where things stopped. The trail simply vanished. Teams searched downstream and upstream for hours, but found no continuation. It was as if Jordan had reached the rocks and either climbed straight out of range or been lifted off the ground entirely. There were no drag marks, no prints, no signs of a slip or fall. The dogs circled, confused, then lay down, a signal the handlers read as scent termination. That single moment reframed the search. Jordan hadn't wandered, he had disappeared. Over the next 3 days, more than 80 personnel canvassed the area on foot. Helicopters circled in tight grids, scanning with both high-res optics and infrared. They flew low enough to see deer paths and discarded trash, but found no trace of a boy in a red flannel. Searchers called his name every few minutes, stopping periodically to listen for any reply, whistle, or movement. Nothing. The forest returned only wind and the creak of branches. By the 3rd day, rainfall moved in again, further eroding the chances of preserving scent, footprints, or anything traceable. On the afternoon of day 4, a ground team found something that sent a jolt through the entire operation. Wedged between 2 large boulders along a slope was a small red mitten, slightly damp, coated with leaf mold. The search paused. Forensics arrived. It was consistent with the type Jordan had been wearing in school photos, but no DNA or fiber evidence could confirm ownership. There was no tag, no initials. And, despite media reports that quickly linked it to Jordan, official statements remained cautious. Dana Malley, when shown a photograph of the mitten, froze. She recognized it immediately, but couldn't prove it was his. That uncertainty would become a recurring theme in everything that followed. As media attention surged, the area transformed from isolated trailhead to a mobile base camp of reporters, investigators, and increasingly frustrated volunteers. Alan Brooks stepped in front of cameras on the 5th day. His voice broke when he described Jordan as a sweet kid who just wanted to help. But when asked why he let him wander off alone, his tone changed. It was still light out. He wasn't a toddler. This wasn't some kind of babysitting accident, he said. We were right there. He didn't scream. He didn't call for help. He just vanished. Online speculation grew almost immediately. Message boards began dissecting Alan's body language, highlighting inconsistencies in his timeline. Reddit threads cataloged satellite images of the area, GPS coordinates, and archived weather data. But behind the public chaos, Donna Malley was building something quieter, a personal investigation. She stayed in a motel 5 miles from the trailhead and began mapping every location search teams had marked. She compiled printed terrain maps, highlighted daily search logs, and annotated every sighting, theory, and dead end. By the second week, the official effort had scaled down. The operation had logged over 200 man-hours and found no further evidence. The search turned passive, meaning patrols would continue, but no additional units would be deployed unless new leads emerged. That shift devastated Donna. She refused to leave, eventually renting a small cabin from a retired couple in the nearby town of Hillsgate. Her walls filled with notes, trail overlays, forensic patterns. She began referring to parts of the forest by names she'd invented: the Split, Dry Mouth Rock, Last Echo Turn. These weren't official terms. They were landmarks in her mind, places she believed her son might still be. One morning, while reviewing her map with a retired SAR volunteer, Donna pointed to the creek bed where the dogs had lost Jordan's scent. If he was taken, she asked, could someone have known that spot was blind? The man didn't answer. He just looked at the elevation lines and circled a tight bend in the terrain. If someone waited here, he finally said, they'd be invisible from every direction but above. Dana never let go of that theory. Over the following months, no more items were found, no new clues surfaced. Alan, Brooks, and Connor returned to their lives. Dana remained. By December, snowfall buried the last physical traces of that October afternoon. But something deeper had taken root, a fracture not just in the case, but in the relationships that surrounded it. Donna began avoiding the Brooks family entirely, refusing interviews and declining any help from them. In her eyes, something about their story didn't add up, and in a forest that offered no signs, no struggle, and no return, the absence itself became its own kind of evidence, a space too clean, too quiet, too perfect to be natural. It was day 11 when a park ranger combing the northeast quadrant of the search zone found something half buried beneath a mat of decomposing leaves and pine needles. He'd passed through the same patch of ground 4 days earlier. Nothing there. But this time, just beyond a moss-covered stump, the edge of a backpack strap poked up from the forest floor. It was a dark, blue canvas bag, one of the same kind Jordan Malley had been photographed carrying the day he left home. The find should have been a breakthrough, but the location raised immediate questions. The bag was only 400 feet from the original campsite, a space not just searched but supposedly cleared early in the operation. Ground crews, dogs, even drone sweeps had passed through that zone repeatedly. Yet no one had seen it before. It hadn't been buried deep, just pressed into the soft earth by moisture and time, like it had only recently been dropped there. Inside, the contents were mostly ruined. Rain and insects had worked their way through the fabric, damaging food wrappers, a spare t-shirt, and a plastic flashlight with corroded batteries. But wedged inside the main compartment, sealed in a gallon-size freezer bag, was a small, spiral-bound notebook. It was water-stained around the edges, but mostly intact. A forensic team cataloged it on site and sent it off for analysis, but not before Dana Malley got a look at it herself. She recognized the handwriting instantly, small, slanted, neat, the same she'd seen on thank-you cards and school worksheets. This was Jordan's voice, preserved on paper. There were only a few pages with legible content, but what survived shifted the tone of the entire case. One entry dated 2 nights before the trip read, "Can't sleep again. Every time I close my eyes, I hear voices, not words, just whispering like far away, like they're outside the house." Another, written during the first night of the trip, simply said, "There was someone outside the tent. I heard steps. Not Mr. Brooks, not Connor. I didn't unzip it, just waited." Investigators were cautious. They suggested the writings were likely the product of anxiety or an overactive imagination. The forest could be loud at night. Animals, shifting branches, falling acorns, all amplified inside a thin nylon shelter. But Dana rejected that outright. She pointed to the phone call she'd had with Jordan the night before he left. "He'd sounded off," she said. quiet, hesitant. He told her, "I don't think I'm wanted here, but I said yes anyway." At the time, she assumed he meant the typical teenage nerves of a kid unsure about fitting in. But in hindsight, she wondered if he'd felt something else, excluded, unwelcome, or worse. She brought that up to detectives. They took the statement, logged it, and moved on. When asked, Connor Brooks denied any problems between them. He said Jordan had been quiet, sure, but fine. He described a normal first day, light hiking, setting up tents, eating trail mix. He said they joked around while collecting firewood, played cards, and that Jordan had laughed at a story Alan told. No arguments, no tension, just an ordinary trip. But school records quietly told a different story. In the month leading up to the trip, teachers had noted that Jordan had begun sitting alone at lunch. One wrote that he seemed distracted, withdrawn, hesitant to partner with his usual group. A guidance counselor had logged a missed appointment. Jordan was supposed to check in after a peer conflict involving group assignments. No follow-up was documented. In online photos from earlier in the year, Jordan and Connor had appeared inseparable. But the most recent ones, tagged just weeks before the trip, showed Connor with other classmates, Jordan absent entirely. There had been a shift, subtle but visible, and no one could explain what caused it. Dinah took this pattern seriously. She believed something had changed between the boys, something Jordan hadn't known how to express. The journal only deepened her suspicion. She became convinced he'd felt unsafe, not just in the woods, but before that, isolated, maybe even targeted. Alan Brooks, when asked about the journal, dismissed it. He was a good kid, he said. But that kind of stuff, the voices, the paranoia, that's not unusual. Especially for a kid who's never camped before. He probably got spooked by a raccoon. But Dana never accepted that explanation. She began building a timeline of Jordan's emotional state in the weeks before the trip. Texts, grades, social patterns. To her, the journal wasn't just a log. It was a warning. And the most disturbing part wasn't the fear Jordan described. It was how quietly he wrote it, how calmly he documented feeling like something, or someone, was waiting outside his tent, and how no one around him seemed to notice. The backpack's sudden appearance so close to the original site added another layer of unease. Investigators insisted it had likely been overlooked, camouflaged by the terrain. But Donna kept asking the same question. Why was it dry on the inside? How had that notebook survived 2 weeks of intermittent rain if it had been there since day one? No one could give her an answer. And the more she studied the words her son had left behind, the more convinced she became that whatever had happened to Jordan wasn't an accident. It was seen. It was known. And someone, maybe someone very close, had decided to keep it quiet. The man came forward anonymously at first, an email sent to the local sheriff's tip line 2 weeks after the search had been scaled down. He identified himself only as B. Wallace and said he had been hiking solo in Loyalsock State Forest on the weekend Jordan disappeared. He hadn't known about the case until returning to his home in Maryland, where a friend had mentioned the story during a conversation. What caught his attention wasn't the timeline, it was the location. The area he'd passed through, he realized, put him roughly 5 miles from Jordan's last known point, and what he'd seen on that morning, October 22nd, had suddenly taken on a very different weight. He described stopping on a ridge near a clearing called Fox Hollow Summit, just after sunrise. It was cold, silent, the kind of morning where every breath hangs in the air like smoke. That's when he noticed someone standing about 40 yards downslope, partially hidden behind a crooked pine. The man was wearing a bright yellow hoodie, the kind that doesn't blend into anything, and camouflage pants tucked into heavy boots. Wallace said he assumed it was another hiker at first, until he realized the man wasn't moving, not walking, not adjusting gear, just standing, watching. They locked eyes briefly, and then the man turned and walked back into the trees. Wallace remembered feeling unsettled, enough to change his route and descend into a ravine to avoid further contact. He didn't see a backpack, didn't see a weapon, but something about the man's posture stuck with him, like he wasn't surprised to be seen, but had been hoping not to be. Once Wallace's identity was confirmed, detectives arranged an interview. He was calm, specific, and able to identify exact landmarks from a topographical map. A forensic artist produced a composite sketch based on his memory. Heavy-set male, mid-40s, beard covering most of his face, hair possibly graying. The eyes, he said, were the most striking detail, alert, deliberate, cold. The sketch bore no resemblance to Alan Brooks or anyone known to live in the surrounding counties. Still, police didn't act. There were no other witnesses, no physical evidence, no indication this man had any connection to Jordan Malley. The official report classified the tip as unconfirmed, low probability. But online, it lit a fire. Within hours of the sketch's quiet release, buried near the bottom of a public bulletin board, true crime forums picked it up. Reddit threads exploded with speculation. One user posted an old game trail camera image from 2010, supposedly taken in the same forest, showing a heavily bearded man crouching just beyond the light flare of a campfire, staring directly at the lens. The photo had never been publicly verified, but its timing and location were enough to stir a wave of theories. Another user claimed to have seen a similar man watching a family hike near Little Bear Run in 2008. The stories piled up fast and none were ever confirmed, but together they began reshaping the public narrative. Loyal Sock, once known for its serenity and isolation, now felt like something else, a place where people could disappear and be replaced by shadows. Reporters latched onto the man in the yellow hoodie. They started calling him the Watcher. Articles speculated about hermits, survivalists, ex-cons living off-grid in the deeper ravines. Locals mentioned hearing strange noises at night, sometimes catching glimpses of makeshift shelters far from marked trails. A hunter described stumbling upon an improvised fire pit surrounded by crude windbreaks, no more than a month old. Another hiker said he'd seen animal carcasses suspended from trees in what looked like a pattern. None of it pointed directly to Jordan, but the atmosphere around his case had changed. Donna Malley saw the sketch and didn't say much at first, but privately she asked investigators whether anyone had ever been found living long-term inside the forest. One ranger recalled a case from 2004, a man discovered after months of building a hidden shelter beneath a collapsed logging road. He'd lived off discarded supplies, hunted small game, and evaded contact for nearly a year. It wasn't impossible, just hard to prove. And so the questions grew louder. Who was the man in the yellow hoodie? Why was he there? Why did he walk away without speaking? And why had Jordan written about hearing voices and movement near his tent, the same night this unknown figure may have been standing just beyond the firelight? Law enforcement stayed silent. They had no suspect, no vehicle, no trail to follow. But for Dana, and for the amateur sleuths who now tracked every breadcrumb in the case, this was no longer a story about a boy who got lost. It was becoming a story about what might have found him. The search shifted tone once again. It wasn't just about recovery anymore. It was about surveillance, about presence. Something, or someone, had been watching, and no one could say for how long or how many others had felt it, but never looked back. The envelope arrived late in the afternoon, wedged between two political flyers and a catalog she hadn't asked for. It was postmarked from Scranton and addressed only to Dana Malley in a handwriting that was oddly neat, slightly spaced out, and clearly written by someone who didn't want to be recognized. There was no return address, no name, just a plain white envelope with a single forever stamp in the top right corner and a faint crease across its center, as if it had been handled too many times before being mailed. Dana didn't open it right away. It was Halloween, 2013, exactly 1 year since Jordan vanished. She had spent the morning alone, as she did most days, surrounded by maps, timelines, and a corkboard covered in strings and pins. She'd stopped attending the vigils by then, stopped answering the local reporters' questions. The story had faded from public conversation, but not from her. She noticed the envelope immediately because it didn't look like a bill or an ad. It looked intentional. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, folded twice. On it was a pencil drawing, faint, smudged at the corners with a jagged rip near the top left. There were trees, a crooked tent, and two figures, one small, drawn with a round head and stick arms, and one much taller, darker, with no facial features at all. The smaller figure had a red X marked across its chest. There were no words, no signature, just the drawing. She stared at it for nearly an hour. Then she called the police. Investigators logged the item into evidence, placing it in a clear, protective sleeve and labeling it as Anonymous Letter, Halloween Delivery. Forensics ran immediate tests. No fingerprints, no smudges, no stray hairs. The envelope had been sealed with saliva, but the DNA was degraded, too weak to produce a viable profile. Their initial response was cautious. Likely a hoax, they said. Maybe a sick joke from someone who'd read about the case. The timing, 1 year to the day, could have been a twisted coincidence. But Dana wasn't convinced. She asked to have the handwriting and drawing analyzed. The Pennsylvania Bureau of Investigation brought in a forensic document examiner who compared the letter to Jordan's old school assignments, math worksheets, journal pages, art projects. What stood out wasn't the subject matter, but the pressure, slant, and spacing, the way Jordan consistently separated his lines from the margins, the upward curve of his lowercase t's, the slight hesitation before each downward stroke. According to the analyst, the drawing shared these traits, not identical, but close enough to suggest it came from someone who had seen Jordan's handwriting up close, possibly even mimicked it. The analyst's conclusion was careful. A strong match in style, pressure, and proportion. Could be the same origin. That phrasing sent Dana into a tailspin. She clung to the possibility that Jordan had drawn it himself, maybe under duress, maybe from wherever he was now. Maybe it was a message, a breadcrumb. The drawing itself was interpreted dozens of ways. The tent, she believed, represented the campsite. The small figure, obviously Jordan. The larger figure with no face became the subject of endless debate, an abductor, a guardian, a symbol. Some argued the red X meant harm. Others suggested it was a plea for help. Online forums reignited. Theories returned with new vigor. Some believed the letter was proof Jordan was still alive, held captive. Others thought it was a cryptic confession from someone involved. A few skeptics, including certain investigators, maintained it was just a cruel prank timed to an emotional anniversary. But Dana felt something deeper. The drawing had arrived in the same week Jordan had begged her not to make him go. It mirrored his journal, the mention of someone moving outside the tent. It echoed the man on the ridge. There were too many parallels to dismiss. She began driving to Scranton every weekend. She walked through post offices, parks, shelters. She left flyers pinned to bulletin boards with only 4 words. I got your drawing. Nothing came of it. No one claimed the letter. No one mailed another. The following month, the state formally reclassified Jordan's case as cold status, no active leads. The file remained open, but resources shifted elsewhere. The search had ended. The media stopped calling. But for Dana, the letter was a pivot point. It didn't close the door. It cracked it open again. Just enough to let in a sliver of hope, or maybe torment. She had a new item to add to her wall. A new piece of the story that didn't explain what happened, but confirmed something else entirely. Someone out there knew more than they had said. Whether it was Jordan or not, the drawing proved one thing. The story wasn't finished. Not yet. 3 years after Jordan Malley vanished, the man who had last seen him quietly disappeared from the town as well. In the spring of 2016, Alan Brooks listed his home in Lewisburg without notice, packed up his belongings, and moved across the country to a gated development outside Flagstaff, Arizona. There was no press release, no explanation. Just a for sale sign, a moving truck, and silence. His son, Connor, was already away at college by then. He didn't return for summer. Friends who had known the family described the move as sudden but not surprising. Donna Malley described it differently, strategic. Within weeks, a renewed wave of suspicion rolled back through the online true crime community. Questions that had never been answered were now being re-asked with urgency. Why had Alan stayed silent so long? Why move now, when the case had just begun fading from the public eye? And most of all, what really happened during those final moments at the campsite? the ones only Alan and Connor would ever know firsthand. Around the same time, a small investigative podcast based in Harrisburg released a 2-part episode on Jordan's case. The host, a former crime reporter, had spent over a year speaking with former neighbors, classmates, and retired officials. What emerged wasn't just a retelling of known facts, it was the introduction of a new claim. An unnamed source, described only as someone close to the search effort, stated they had overheard Alan tell a ranger on day 1 that he and Jordan had argued just before the boy went missing. The fight, according to the source, had something to do with a missing phone, Jordan's, which was never recovered. The implication was vague, but it set fire to everything. Alan was reached for comment through a reporter days after the episode aired. He called the claim internet garbage, said he'd never laid a hand on that boy, and insisted the trip had been entirely peaceful. Jordan wasn't upset. There was no fight, no tension, nothing. This kind of gossip isn't just false, it's cruel, he said. But by then, the narrative had taken hold. It didn't help that shortly after the podcast's release, a Freedom of Information request submitted by a Reddit group unearthed unsealed court documents from Alan's past, specifically a 2005 domestic assault investigation involving his then-wife, Connor's mother. The report described a heated altercation during which Alan had allegedly thrown a piece of furniture and been temporarily removed from the home. The charges were dropped. The marriage ended the following year. Alan was never convicted of anything, but the resurfacing of those documents fueled speculation that Jordan's disappearance hadn't been as calm and unremarkable as previously claimed. Dana Malley refused to comment publicly on the podcast or the court records, but privately, she added both to her investigation board. She printed the court documents, highlighted key portions, and drew lines connecting names, dates, and locations. She also revisited something that had always bothered her, the precise location of the original campsite. Official maps from 2012 showed the Brooks camp set up at a spot called Granite Hollow, a low-elevation basin near a dry stream bed. But a retired park ranger named Scott Vann, who had been part of the initial field logistics team, stepped forward that year with a statement of his own. He claimed Alan had been told, more than once, not to camp in that particular location. It was technically outside of designated overnight zones, posted with signs that warned of flood-prone ground and minimal visibility. "There's a reason people don't pitch tents there," Vann said. "It's too easy to disappear." According to Vann, Alan had been warned about that same habit before, favoring isolated off-route spots with less foot traffic. It wasn't illegal, but it raised red flags, especially considering Jordan's journal entry about hearing movement outside the tent, especially considering how close the dry creek bed was to where the dogs had lost the trail. Meanwhile, Connor Brooks shut down entirely. He deleted old social media accounts, changed his phone number, and declined every interview request. The last public photo of him was from a college event in 2015. After that, nothing. When asked, friends said only that he didn't talk about the past, that it was off limits. For Dana, the silence spoke volumes, not just the lack of answers, but the timing of Alan's departure, the defensive posture, the disappearing witnesses. She believed Alan knew more than he had ever said. Not necessarily that he had harmed her son, but that something happened out there in the woods, something that shook him enough to bury it and then run from it. By the end of that year, the case remained cold, unsolved, uncharged, unresolved. But now it carried a new layer of discomfort. Jordan hadn't just vanished. The man who brought him there had, in his own way, vanished too. Not into the forest, but into the legal and emotional shadows that so often surround stories like this. And somewhere in Arizona, the last adult to see Jordan Malley alive was now a ghost in a neighborhood of desert cul-de-sacs, saying nothing, answering to no one, and leaving behind a trail of doubts that refused to fade. It had been nearly 10 years since Jordan Malley disappeared when a storm changed everything. On the night of May 3, 2022, a violent front rolled through north-central Pennsylvania. Winds topping 70 miles per hour, lightning flashing across the ridgelines, trees cracking open like bones. In the morning, the damage stretched across miles of forest. Branches littered the trails, old growth lay splintered across the hollows. Among them, a century-old oak, massive, weather-beaten, and long dead at the core, had come down hard into a slope of shale and moss just east of the original search radius. The tree had stood alone for generations, its roots spread wide, burrowed deep into the hillside like fingers. 2 days later, a local conservation worker assigned to assess storm damage was hiking the area when something caught his eye. Tangled in the exposed roots was a strip of black nylon, twisted and half buried in mud. Curious, he stepped closer and saw a cracked plastic casing, a headlamp, faded and shattered, its straps disintegrating. Nearby, tucked beneath a loosened stone, was something else. Something that didn't belong to the forest. A child's hiking boot, split at the toe, laces long gone. He didn't touch anything. He backed away, marked the GPS, and called it in. The response was immediate. Investigators returned to the woods for the first time in years, this time not to search, but to excavate. The location was just under half a mile from the original campsite, but it sat deep in a gulch that hadn't been visible from the air in 2012. Dense canopy above, sloped terrain below, and no clear trail leading in or out. It was the kind of place you'd never find unless something brought you there, or unless something fell and pulled the earth with it. As the forensic team dug through the disturbed soil, more emerged, a rusted belt buckle with the remnants of canvas threading still attached, and near it, buried beneath a shelf of rock, a small water-damaged notebook, fragile, mold-lined, barely holding together. The cover had long since deteriorated, but tucked between the middle pages, protected by pressure and time, one line of pencil remained legible. 16 words, faint but unmistakable. He lied. I didn't go the wrong way. I saw the trail. He told me to wait. The writing matched Jordan's. The news traveled fast. For a case that had gone silent for nearly a decade, the discovery reignited everything. Media outlets returned, headlines resurrected the story, and public interest surged overnight. But for Dana Malley, the moment was quieter, hollow, shaking. She had waited 10 years for something, anything, that proved her son had been where she always believed he was. And now it had come up from the roots of a fallen tree. The items were cataloged and confirmed. The headlamp had been the same model Jordan brought on the trip. The boot matched the pair he'd worn to school the week before. The belt buckle had once belonged to his hiking pack. And the handwriting. Dana didn't need an analyst to confirm it. She recognized it instantly. But what the note suggested, that someone told Jordan to wait, that he didn't get lost on his own, changed the framework of the case. The implication was subtle, but brutal. For years, the official position had been that Jordan had wandered off, become disoriented, or succumbed to the elements. Now, those words suggested otherwise. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't a wrong turn. He had seen the trail. He knew where to go, and someone, he, told him not to. Speculation exploded, most focused on Alan Brooks. He had moved out of state. He had never altered his story. He claimed Jordan had simply walked into the trees to get firewood and never came back. But if this note was true, if Jordan had been told to stay put, the natural question was, by whom? Donna revisited her timeline. She re-examined the statements, the inconsistencies. She brought the notebook to her lawyer, asking what it meant, legally, practically. But there were no charges, no indictments, only fragments, the boot, the lamp, the page. Enough to confirm Jordan had reached that gulch, but not enough to say how or why he ended up there. The location itself raised other questions. Why hadn't the area been searched in 2012? Why had dogs lost the trail near the creek bed just above this very ravine? Had someone led him there? Or had he gone willingly, trusting someone who told him it was safe to wait? For Dana, the pain wasn't just that her son had died. It was that he might have waited for help, for hours, maybe longer, never knowing that help wasn't coming. And the tree that covered him all these years, roots pressed over soil like a lid on a secret, had kept that truth buried until the storm. Until time and weather finally tore it loose, there were no remains, no skeleton, only items degraded and partial. But for the first time, there was physical evidence. For the first time, the story had a location. And beneath that broken oak, in the silence of the gulch, the ground had finally spoken. The phrase echoed louder than anything had in the decade since Jordan vanished. He told me to wait. Those 6 words, scrawled in faded pencil across a decayed notebook page, sent a ripple through every corner of the investigation and every person who had ever touched the case. Within a week of its discovery, the forensic handwriting analyst brought in to verify authorship issued a formal statement, high probability match with Jordan Malley's writing. The spacing, the lowercase formation, the distinctive inward lean of his T stems, all consistent. It was, almost certainly, his. But what did it mean? Theories began multiplying instantly. Some believed it was proof Jordan had been left behind intentionally, that someone, perhaps Alan Brooks, told him to stay put while knowing he wouldn't return. Others argued it was a misunderstanding gone horribly wrong, a well-intentioned instruction that became fatal in the shifting shadows of an unfamiliar forest. But the word lied, the first line of the note, carried a different weight. It suggested awareness, betrayal, a decision. Alan Brooks, now in Arizona, was contacted for a formal re-interview by Pennsylvania State Police. They flew out and met him in a neutral setting. He declined to have a lawyer present, insisting he had nothing to hide. When shown a digital image of the notebook page, he stared at it for over 30 seconds before saying, "I've never seen that before." He denied ever telling Jordan to wait for him, denied any argument, denied any situation where Jordan would have misunderstood his intentions. "That boy walked off. That's all I know. I didn't abandon him." But investigators noted his tone had changed, flatter, more calculated. It didn't carry the same pleading weight of his earlier interviews. When asked why Jordan would write that, he said, "You're asking a dead boy to explain his thoughts. I can't." Connor Brooks, now in his mid-20s, did not respond to requests for comment. He did not return emails, voicemails, or certified letters. His silence became its own haunting presence in the unfolding story, a blank space where something, anything, should have been. Meanwhile, Dana Malley, fueled by the notebook and the recovered items, filed a civil suit against Alan Brooks for wrongful death and emotional harm. She didn't expect a conviction. She wanted answers under oath. The filing named specific details: the off-trail campsite, the delay in reporting Jordan missing, the alleged confrontation over the missing phone, and now, the note. As legal proceedings began, forensic teams returned to the gulch. The tree had disturbed more than roots. It had opened up soil that hadn't been touched in decades. During the sweep, ground-penetrating radar picked up irregularities around the base of a slope just beyond the fire pit. Excavation teams moved carefully. They found blackened rocks, partial burn patterns, and what remained of a makeshift fire ring. Just outside it, in a layer of compacted sediment, they uncovered small bone fragments, scattered, brittle, some bearing clear signs of animal scavenging. One bone in particular stood out, a partial radius, possibly juvenile. Early measurements and comparative analysis suggested it could belong to someone Jordan's age and size, but the lack of a complete skeleton made formal identification impossible. DNA extraction attempts yielded no usable material. Still, the implication was devastating. Experts debated the likely scenario: death by exposure worsened by waiting in vain, or perhaps a slow decline into hypothermia and dehydration while still believing someone was coming back. But the presence of a fire pit, one Jordan likely built, suggested he had fought to stay alive, that he had prepared, waited, hoped. But he'd also written that someone lied. Psychologists brought into the civil case offered testimony about the psychological dynamics of authority and dependence in isolated environments. A boy like Jordan, unfamiliar with the wild, would follow instructions. If told to wait, even if afraid, he would. And if help never came, the consequences weren't just tragic, they were irreversible. Public opinion split. Some saw the situation as a heartbreaking accident. A man made a poor judgment call, and a boy paid the price. Others saw something darker, a pattern of control, avoidance, silence from both Alan and Connor that suggested more than just bad luck. In the end, the court did not reach a verdict. The case stalled in pre-trial motion. Alan Brooks filed to dismiss based on lack of evidence, and without a confirmed cause of death or living witness, the motion stood. The notebook page, though powerful in narrative, was not legally admissible as direct proof of intent. Still, something had shifted. The notebook wasn't just a clue. It was Jordan's voice, 10 years after the fact, speaking from the very place he had waited. And whether it proved neglect, abandonment, or something more calculated, it ensured one thing. The myth of a boy who simply wandered into the woods had collapsed. Jordan hadn't been lost. He'd been told to stay, and no one ever came back. The silence ended on a Tuesday morning in June 2023, when a local journalist from the Lewisburg Sentinel published an article that immediately shifted the weight of the decade-old mystery. The title was quiet, almost clinical. Witness finally speaks in Malley disappearance, but the words inside were anything but. The source, confirmed as Connor Brooks, now 24, had agreed to speak under initial conditions of anonymity. That request lasted less than 24 hours before he voluntarily waived it. He said he was tired of holding it in, that it had followed him for too long, that he needed to say what happened, or at least what he saw. For years, Connor had been a ghost in the narrative, present at the start, then silent, vanishing into college and private life. Donna had called him the last living thread. Investigators had tried to reach him multiple times. He never answered. But in the interview, he told the reporter he couldn't ignore it anymore. He'd watched the footage of the storm-felled tree, read the note Jordan left behind, and something about seeing his friend's words again, scrawled in desperation, accusing someone of a lie, undid him. He began by correcting a detail that had gone unchallenged for years. According to Connor, the story about Jordan offering to get firewood on his own wasn't exactly true. He said it was Alan who suggested it, that his father had taken Jordan aside around dusk, outside earshot, and told him it would be a good chance to learn. He remembered hearing Alan use the phrase, "Let's go find you some wood the way." Connor had stayed back near the fire pit, fiddling with the gear bag, assuming they were just walking a few feet into the brush. Only Alan came back. When Connor asked where Jordan was, Alan told him that Jordan had gone off trail, that he wanted to prove he could be independent, that he'd find his way back before dark. When Connor asked if they should go after him, Alan told him to give it time. He'd be fine. He just needed to figure it out for himself. Connor said he believed him, at least at first. He described his father as confident, not alarmed, not anxious, just certain. But when night fell and the woods closed in and Jordan hadn't returned, the feeling in Connor's chest shifted. He said he wanted to search, but Alan told him not to, that moving around in the dark would make things worse, that it was safer to wait until morning. By daylight, when they still hadn't found him, Alan called the police. But by then, the narrative was fixed. Jordan had gone to get firewood on his own. No one had sent him. No one had seen anything. When the journalist asked Connor why he hadn't come forward earlier, he paused. He said he wasn't proud of it. That fear and guilt had shaped everything that followed. It was easier to believe my dad was just wrong, he said, than to believe he might have done something worse. Then came the part that hit the hardest. Connor admitted he had seen someone else in the forest, not the day Jordan vanished, but the day before, late afternoon, maybe 100 feet away, standing just beyond the edge of the trees near a slope that faced away from camp. A man in a yellow hoodie and camouflage pants. He described him as still, watching, half hidden behind a tree. Connor said the sight chilled him. He didn't tell his father, didn't tell Jordan, didn't even fully register it until after everything went wrong. When asked why he never mentioned it in the weeks, months, or years that followed, he said, "Because I thought maybe it didn't matter. Or maybe it would just make things worse, and I didn't know what was worse than what already happened." The interview ignited national attention. The composite sketch of the man in the yellow hoodie resurfaced. Online communities broke it down frame by frame against Connor's account. Comparisons were made to other sightings, the 2010 trail cam image, the Fox Hollow Summit claim. It wasn't just speculation anymore. Now it had a second witness. Alan Brooks refused all further comment. Reporters camped outside his Arizona residence. He issued a one-line statement through a lawyer. "My son is confused, and I won't be dragged into this circus." He declined to participate in any further interviews and ignored all contact from Pennsylvania State Police. But the court of public opinion had already rendered its own verdict. Talk shows dissected the story. Podcasts dedicated entire episodes to the timeline. For the first time, people stopped asking what happened and started asking why it was hidden for so long. Connor didn't appear again after the interview aired. He declined follow-ups, returned to private life. But his words remained. A quiet unraveling of the official story, spoken not with blame, but with the weight of someone who had finally run out of excuses to stay quiet. And in the echo of his confession, the story gained something it hadn't had in a decade. Direction, not clarity, not justice, but forward movement. Jordan hadn't disappeared alone. Someone walked him into the woods, someone told him to wait, and someone else saw the truth and lived with it in silence, until now. They went back to the gulch one final time in early autumn 2023, as the leaves began to turn and the air grew colder in the mornings. The site where the oak tree had fallen still bore the scars of the storm. Jagged roots frozen in midair, shattered bark, a gash torn into the slope where the earth had given way. But the forensic teams weren't looking at the tree anymore. They were studying the hillside itself, in particular, a shallow depression a few yards beyond where Jordan's boot and notebook had been discovered. It wasn't obvious, just a slight sag in the soil, subtle enough that it would have meant nothing if not for the context. But now, everything was context. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed a void beneath the top layer, compacted, disturbed, and artificially shaped. They began digging by hand, inch by inch, working through loam and root clusters until the outline became clear. This wasn't erosion, it was a cache. And inside it, they found 3 objects. The first was a coil of green rope, frayed at both ends, knotted in the center, stiff from years underground. The second was a camping knife, stainless steel blade dulled and rusted, handle still intact, engraved with a faded brand logo. The third was what stopped everyone cold, a human tooth, small, worn, preserved enough to extract identifiers. The forensic team processed it quickly. Jordan Malley had undergone a dental exam in 2011. Those records were still on file. The match came back within days. It was his. This was confirmation, not symbolic, not inferred, physical, undeniable. Jordan had died in this place. He hadn't wandered far from camp. He hadn't slipped into a ravine or been carried off by wildlife. He had ended up here, less than half a mile from where he was last seen. Misled, possibly abandoned, possibly worse. But even with that, there was no way to determine how he died. No skeletal remains, no trauma signatures. The tooth, while critical, told them almost nothing about his final moments. Whether it had been lost during a fall, pulled loose under stress, or dislodged after death, no one could say. The rope and knife raised further questions, but without context, they were circumstantial. The area had seen hikers, hunters, even off-grid squatters over the years. The objects could have been unrelated. Or they could have belonged to the last person who saw him alive. Prosecutors reviewed the findings, but declined to pursue charges. The statute of limitations for negligence had long passed. For anything more serious, manslaughter, homicide, they needed a cause of death, a body, a timeline. The notebook was compelling. Connor's interview had raised doubts, but in the eyes of the law, there wasn't enough. And so, the case reached its legal end, not with an indictment, but with silence. In January 2024, Alan Brooks died of a heart attack in his home in Arizona. He was 64. There was no obituary, no public statement, just a line in the local paper confirming his passing. His estate passed quietly to Connor, who declined all contact and made no mention of the case. Alan never spoke another word about what happened, never clarified what was said to Jordan in those final moments, never addressed the note, the rope, the knife, or the boy's missing phone. Whatever he knew, or didn't, died with him. Dana Malley traveled to the gulch in the spring. She went alone. The trail had been reopened after the investigation closed, though most locals still avoided the area. Too many headlines, too much history. She brought with her a bronze plaque no bigger than a dinner plate. She placed it at the base of the tree's exposed root system, where the earth had spilled out like a wound. The inscription read, "This is where I found you." It didn't mark a grave. There were no remains to bury, but it marked something else, a line between the unknown and the known, between the years she had spent searching and the moment the forest gave something back. And that was the truth she was left with. Jordan had died in that gulch, maybe from the cold, maybe from waiting too long, maybe from trusting someone who shouldn't have been trusted. But the mystery that began in the final daylight of October never fully unraveled. There were no witnesses, no proof, no final word. Just a tree that fell at the right angle, on the right slope, in the right season, and tore open 10 years of silence. Had it not fallen, none of this would have come to light. The backpack, the note, the fire pit, the tooth, the lie, the weight. In the end, the forest didn't keep the secret forever. It gave back pieces, just enough to know that something happened in those woods, something that should never have happened, but not enough to understand why, not enough to call it justice. And so the case closed where it had begun, in the wilderness, with a boy who trusted someone to come back, and a mother who waited longer than anyone should ever have to.